It started like any other Saturday morning. The sun was peeking over the rooftops, birds chirping, coffee brewing, and I had just settled into my favorite chair on the porch with a steaming cup in hand. There's a certain comfort in routine, the quiet rhythm of suburban life, the way the wind rustles through the maple trees, and the soft hum of sprinklers across the street. I was finally starting to relax after a long week when I heard it. A sharp, deliberate knock on the door, not the soft, polite tap of a neighbor borrowing sugar or a package delivery. No, this was different. It carried a weight, a confidence that said, I belong here, whether you like it or not. My stomach sank just a little as I put my coffee down and walked toward the door. And then I saw her, Karen. She was every bit as dramatic as I remembered. Sunglasses perched on her nose, heels clicking against the concrete like a drumbeat of authority, and a look on her face that screamed, I have a mission and you are my obstacle. She was holding something small and shiny in her hand, a key. But not just any key. She called it her master key. According to her, it could unlock any door in the neighborhood. Good morning, I said cautiously, trying to keep my tone friendly because, well, I was still unsure if I needed to call the police already. Can I help you? I'm here to inspect your home, she said, her voice sharp and precise, like she had been practicing this line in front of a mirror. I have the master key. I can open any door in this neighborhood, and I will do it if necessary. I blinked, any door, huh? Well, you're welcome to try. That's when the suspense hit. She didn't hesitate. She lifted the key, slid it into the lock, and turned. And nothing. The lock didn't budge. Not a click, not a jingle, not a whisper. It refused to cooperate. Her eyes narrowed. She tried again, jiggling it slightly, muttering under her breath about compliance, rules, and enforcement. I pressed myself against the doorframe, careful not to let her see me laughing. Part of me wanted to shout, maybe this door didn't get the HOA memo, but I didn't. I waited, heart pounding, curious to see how far she would go. After a moment, she straightened, her shoulders stiff. There was a shift in her energy from confident to desperate. She took a step back, fished a phone from her purse, and started dialing. That's when I realized she wasn't just frustrated, she was escalating. She was calling for backup. I could hear her voice through the door. Her tone was loud, dramatic, and full of urgency as she described me, my house, and my supposed hostile resistance to the dispatcher. Each word made my pulse quicken. Was this really happening? Was she actually calling 911 over a door? I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I peeked through the blinds and saw her packing. The way she gestured and waved the key around made her look like a general rallying troops in some imaginary battle. I imagined filming this moment, HOA Karen versus the door that wouldn't budge, and couldn't stop myself from smiling. But I forced myself to stop. This was serious. The minutes dragged on like hours. Each passing second built tension in my chest. I couldn't predict how this would end. Would the police come inside with her because she was the HOA? Would she try to force the door anyway? Or would this all blow over in humiliation? Then I heard it, distant sirens, faint at first, then growing steadily louder. My stomach flipped. The authorities were on their way. Karen straightened, phone still pressed to her ear, voice rising in panic and frustration. She had no idea that the moment she made that call, her little plan had taken a turn for the worse. I sank back into my chair, gripping my coffee like a lifeline. The suspense was unbearable. Every second, my mind raced through possibilities. Would she storm in any way? Would she get caught? Who would arrive first? And most importantly, who would be on the other side of that cruiser when it pulled into my driveway? And just like that, the peaceful morning I had pictured was gone. The battle lines were drawn. The game had begun. Karen didn't seem to notice the sirens in the distance yet. She was too focused, too consumed with proving herself, and of course, too convinced that her master key would bend the universe to her will. I watched through the blinds as she crouched slightly, inspecting the lock like it had personally offended her. She muttered words under her breath, half frustration, half outrage, about compliance, enforcement, and the sacred duties of the HOA. I could barely contain my amusement. I imagined the scene in slow motion. Karen, a self-appointed sovereign of suburban law, kneeling before my front door as if the key were Excalibur itself. I almost expected her to let out a dramatic battle cry, demanding the door surrender. My first thought was to grab my phone and start filming, but part of me worried that recording might escalate things faster than necessary. She tried again, her hands trembling slightly this time. She twisted the key, pushed, yanked, and muttered a few more threats about fines, violations, and consequences. And still nothing. The lock refused her, silent and immovable. My lips twitched in a suppressed grin. The sheer absurdity of it made me feel like I was living in a sitcom. A very tense, potentially legal sitcom. "Are you sure it's not broken?" I called lightly from behind the door, pretending to be oblivious. Her head shot up, her expression twisted between disbelief and fury. "This is impossible," she snapped. Her voice, normally loud and commanding, now carried a tinge of panic. "I have the master key. It should work on every door, every single one, including yours." I leaned casually against the doorframe, sipping my coffee. "Well, either it's a very stubborn lock, or your master key is a little overrated." Karen's frown deepened. She muttered something about neighborly compliance and rules that must be enforced immediately. Then, as if she just remembered her next act in a rehearsed play, she pulled out her phone with exaggerated urgency. I could almost hear the dramatic swell of music in my mind as she dialed. The next few minutes were a blur. I caught fragments of her conversation, words like hostile, non-compliant, emergency, and immediate assistance. Her voice was tense, clipped, full of that performative urgency only someone who thrives on confrontation can summon. She painted a picture of me as some kind of dangerous homeowner, completely ignoring that the most immediate threat in the situation was her own overinflated sense of authority. I stood frozen behind the door, heart racing. I didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or run for cover. Every second that passed felt heavier. The sirens grew louder, closer, echoing through the neighborhood like a countdown clock. My mind raced. Who would arrive first, the authorities or Karen's ego? I watched her packing back and forth, phone clutched tightly to her ear, key still dangling in the other hand like a weapon of mass intimidation. She stopped for a moment, lifted the key again, and tried once more. The lock didn't move. Nothing budged. She froze, blinking at it as if willing it to obey. And then came the quiet, subtle moment that made me realize the absurdity and the suspense of the situation. Karen's hand tightened on the phone, her voice rising, pleading now instead of commanding. She was calling for backup, escalating this to a level I could never have predicted when I first saw her walking down the street. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I peeked again through the blinds. My neighbors had begun to notice something was happening, though they were careful not to interfere, some whispering, some craning their necks to see the spectacle. Karen's performance was drawing an audience, whether she wanted one or not. And then, over the faint hum of traffic and the growing tension in my chest, I heard it, the first note of distant sirens, just faint enough to make my pulse jump. Closer, louder, approaching. Karen's head snapped up, panic briefly breaking through her fury. She straightened, trying to appear calm, professional, in control, but her trembling fingers and quickened breath betrayed her. The authorities were on their way, and for the first time, she wasn't the one in control. I sank back into my chair, gripping my coffee like a lifeline, and realized something important. This wasn't just a Saturday morning anymore. This was the beginning of a confrontation that could either humiliate her or end in something far worse for me. The suspense in the air was almost physical, thick and heavy, like electricity before a storm. The door hadn't opened, the key hadn't worked, and the sirens were getting closer. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain: this was far from over. The sound of sirens grew steadily louder, bouncing off the houses like some ominous soundtrack to a suburban thriller. I sat back in my chair, gripping my coffee like a lifeline, and tried to steady my racing heart. Every instinct screamed at me, this is about to get real. Yet, part of me couldn't help but marvel at the absurdity of it all. Here I was, sitting in my own living room, while Karen, the self-proclaimed enforcer of all things HOA, was outside calling 911 over a door that refused to open. I took a slow breath and tried to focus. I peeked through the blinds and saw her still packing, phone pressed to her ear, key dangling in her other hand like some sort of magic wand that had failed spectacularly. Her voice, though muffled, carried across the street, dripping with urgency and panic. "Yes, they're refusing to comply. Yes, I'm serious. This is dangerous." She was trying to sell her story as though she were reporting a home invasion. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood had started to notice. A few neighbors had ventured to their windows, curiosity piqued. Some whispered to each other, while others chuckled quietly behind closed curtains. I could almost hear the collective amusement of the street, all unknowingly watching Karen's ego unravel. I sank lower into my chair, letting the tension wash over me. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, counting down the seconds before the sirens arrived. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside made me flinch. I imagined the door bursting open, law enforcement storming in, and Karen standing triumphantly, except nothing like that had happened yet. I tried to rationalize the situation. "Stay calm," I told myself. "Nothing illegal has happened. You're within your rights." But even as I reassured myself, the suspense tightened around my chest like a vice. Who would arrive first? How would they respond to her dramatics? And more importantly, who would be standing on the other side of that cruiser when it finally pulled into my driveway? The sirens drew nearer, punctuated now by the crunch of tires on asphalt. I could see flashing lights reflecting off the houses across the street. My stomach flipped. Karen, still packing, had no idea what or who was about to arrive. Her plan to assert authority was about to collide with reality in a way she could never have anticipated. I considered stepping outside to confront her, but a voice in my head whispered no. Let this play out. I imagined the scene from a distance, savoring the tension. Karen's overconfidence, her misplaced sense of entitlement, and her theatrical gestures were about to meet a dose of real authority, and I wouldn't have to lift a finger. The sirens came to a stop in front of my house. My pulse pounded in my ears as I leaned forward, peeking through the blinds. The cruiser's lights bathed the driveway in red and blue, and for a split second, I held my breath, imagining the worst. Then the door to the cruiser opened. Out stepped a uniformed officer, tall, calm, and confident. And for a moment, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just any officer. It was my son. My own son, standing there with his badge gleaming, the embodiment of authority and control. Karen froze. She didn't recognize him at first. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The key in her hand seemed suddenly useless, her voice faltering as she tried to explain herself. I called about a situation," she stammered, waving the key as if it would lend her credibility. My son stepped forward, calm and measured. "I'm Officer Name, assigned to this area. I understand you called 911. Can you tell me what's going on?" The tension was electric. I felt it in my chest, in my arms, in the very air around me. Karen's face went from determination to confusion, then to panic. This was not part of her plan. The person she expected to intimidate was now a trained officer, my son, ready to assess the situation professionally and fairly. I sank back into my chair, trying to hide my grin. The suspense had reached its peak. Karen's overconfidence, her insistence on control, and her theatrical display of power were about to collide with reality in a way she could never anticipate. And at that moment, I realized the real twist wasn't coming from me, or even from Karen. It was coming from the young man standing firmly in the driveway, who just happened to be my son. The moment my son stepped out of the cruiser, I felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. Relief because now there was someone trained, authoritative, and calm on the scene. Disbelief because, well, it was my son. My own flesh and blood, in full uniform, badge gleaming in the morning sun, standing like the perfect counterpoint to Karen's chaos. Karen didn't recognize him at first. She held the master key in her hand, waving it like a wand, still clinging to the illusion of power. "I'm here because of a dangerous situation," she declared loudly, trying to project authority. "There's a homeowner here refusing to comply with HOA regulations. I need immediate assistance." My son tilted his head slightly, calm and composed, and met her gaze. "I understand you called 911, he said evenly. "Can you tell me exactly what the emergency is?" Karen faltered. Her words stumbled out in a rush, a chaotic mix of exaggeration and accusation. This homeowner is non-compliant. I tried to enter with my master key. She refused. This is dangerous. There could be. I almost laughed. The way she was fumbling like a deer caught in headlights was surreal. But I stayed quiet, gripping my coffee, letting the suspense simmer. I could feel the neighborhood watching, holding their breath along with me. Every second Karen hesitated, the tension grew thicker. My son, professional and unwavering, didn't interrupt. He listened patiently, taking notes, asking clarifying questions. Karen's face went from smug confidence to visible panic. Every exaggerated claim she made only made her appear more desperate under the steady, calm scrutiny of law enforcement. "You're saying you have a master key that can open any door?" my son asked, his tone neutral but firm. Karen nodded vigorously. "Yes, it's a master key. It should open any door and he refused me entry. That's noncompliance." I swallowed a laugh. My son raised an eyebrow. "And yet, here we are, standing outside your alleged emergency. You weren't able to enter the home." Karen faltered. "Well, her voice trailed off. Her confidence was evaporating before my eyes. The lock hadn't worked, the authority she thought she wielded was meaningless, and the law enforcement officer assessing the situation was my son. I could almost hear the collective gasp of the street, even though the neighbors were trying to stay subtle. Some peeked through blinds, others through their porches, all witnesses to Karen's unraveling. The tension was almost unbearable. Every second was charged, like waiting for a storm to break. My son continued methodically. "The homeowner is within their rights to refuse entry unless a court order or warrant is presented. Your master key does not give you legal authority to force entry." Karen's face turned red. She opened her mouth to argue but paused, as though the words she had carefully prepared were no longer relevant. The power she assumed she held, the drama she'd built up in her mind, was crumbling around her. I stayed in the background, sipping my coffee, marveling at the scene. The suspense wasn't just in the outcome, it was in watching the slow collapse of someone who thought they were untouchable. Every twitch, every hesitation on her face made the moment feel cinematic. Then my son leaned slightly forward, voice low but firm. "I need you to understand that making a false emergency report is a serious matter. Misuse of 911 can have consequences." Karen froze. For a moment, she looked like she might faint. The key in her hand now seemed useless, a symbol of her misplaced authority. She took a step back, trying to regain composure, but it was too late. The scene was set. The drama was no longer hers to control. I could see it, the realization creeping across her face. Her plan to assert dominance over me had completely failed. The master key, her sense of entitlement, even her dramatic call to 911, all rendered meaningless in the presence of real authority. And the authority? My son, calm, professional, unwavering, and completely unimpressed by her theatrics. For the first time that morning, I felt a shift. The tension, which had been building like a coiled spring, started to release. Karen had misjudged everything. I had remained calm. And now, the tables had turned in the most perfect way imaginable. I took a deep breath, letting the suspense linger just a little longer, because I knew, whatever happened next would be unforgettable. Karen was about to learn that the streets she thought she ruled were no longer hers to command. Karen's face was a study in disbelief. I've seen people shocked, people angry, people embarrassed, but watching someone try to hold onto authority while it slips through their fingers, that's a rare spectacle, and I was watching it unfold in slow motion. My son stood there, calm and professional, listening to Karen's tirade as though he were evaluating a minor traffic violation, not the theatrical emergency she had conjured. Each word she sputtered about noncompliance, threats, and her supposed rights was met with a quiet, steady gaze. He didn't interrupt, didn't raise his voice, didn't flinch. He just absorbed her chaos and prepared to dismantle it piece by piece. She tried again, waving the master key like a sword. "I have the authority. I can enter any house," she insisted, voice quivering now despite her effort to stay commanding. My son tilted his head slightly and asked, calm but firm, "Do you have a court order or warrant that grants you the right to enter?" Her jaw dropped. She blinked once, twice, trying to process what he had just said. My pulse quickened as I realized the stakes had just shifted. The authority she wielded like a weapon, the same authority she had flaunted over neighbors, fines, and petty HOA disputes, was meaningless here. She had assumed power where none existed. Her voice faltered. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. Words that had seemed perfect in her head dissolved into thin air. Her dramatic gestures slowed. The confidence she had carried into the street like armor was cracking, exposing raw panic beneath. I stayed in the background, heart pounding, trying not to laugh. The suspense was electric. Every neighbor peeking through their blinds, every passerby slowing to watch, was witnessing her unraveling in real time. I imagined the whispers spreading down the street. "Karen's lost it. The master key doesn't work. The authorities are here." Then came the part that made my stomach twist with suspense and amusement. My son leaned slightly on his cruiser, arms crossed, voice steady and deliberate. "You need to understand that making a false emergency report is a serious offense. Misuse of 911 can carry legal consequences." Karen froze. The weight of those words hit her like a ton of bricks. Her key, which she had treated like the ultimate symbol of power, now looked ridiculous in her trembling hand. For the first time, the tables had completely turned. She wasn't the person in control. She was exposed, vulnerable, and utterly powerless. She opened her mouth, probably to argue, but I could see the doubt creeping in. Her carefully crafted narrative, the one she had practiced in front of the mirror and rehearsed for the neighbors, had completely collapsed. Every word she spoke now sounded hollow, desperate, almost pathetic. I felt a rush of relief mixed with pride. Relief because the tension that had been building all morning was finally about to resolve, and pride because my son was handling the situation with a professionalism and calm I had always hoped he'd carry into the world. Karen's eyes darted around, searching for support, for some validation, for anyone who could rescue her from this humiliation. But there was no one. The neighbors, who had gathered discreetly at windows and porches, were witnessing her come undone. Some stifled laughs, some whispered quietly, all watching as her authority crumbled. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the suspense linger a little longer. Karen had set herself up for a fall, and I was watching it happen in real time. My son remained steady, patient, and unshakable, answering every accusation, countering every claim, and maintaining an aura of calm that made Karen's panic look even more exaggerated. Finally, she stepped back, key lowering slightly, voice trembling as she muttered something about rules and regulations. Her confidence was gone, replaced by the dawning realization that she had overreached in spectacular fashion. Every dramatic gesture, every claim of authority, every exaggerated 911 call had led to this moment, exposed, powerless, and for the first time, completely human in the eyes of the entire neighborhood. And in that moment, I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The suspense that had been building all morning, the uncertainty, the fear, the anxiety, had reached its peak. Karen had collided with reality, and reality had won. But even as I allowed myself a small, private smile, I knew the story wasn't over. The next few moments would seal her fate and give the neighborhood a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. The final act of this suburban drama was just beginning, and I could hardly wait to see how it ended. Karen's confidence had evaporated like morning mist over the driveway. The master key that had once been her ultimate symbol of power now dangled limply in her hand, useless, meaningless. I could see it in her eyes, the disbelief, the panic, the creeping realization that she had completely misjudged the situation. My son stood firm, calm, and steady, his uniform pristine, badge gleaming, exuding the kind of authority that no HOA president could ever fake. Every word he spoke, every pause he took, chipped away at Karen's facade, leaving her exposed for the neighborhood to see. "You don't have a court order," he said calmly, "and there's no emergency here. This is not a situation that warrants forced entry." Karen's mouth opened and closed several times, trying to form a retort, but the words wouldn't come. Her rehearsed lines had dissolved into thin air, leaving only flustered accusations and frantic gestures. I watched her take a step back, a defensive posture replacing the arrogance she had carried onto the street. I have the master key," she blurted, as if sheer repetition could somehow make it true. "I can enter any home, it's my duty." My son, without missing a beat, raised an eyebrow and said, "Having a key does not give you legal authority to enter anyone's home. That is not how the law works." A hush seemed to settle over the street. I could feel the tension like electricity in the air. The neighbors who had peeked through blinds and windows were now silently watching, captivated. Karen's ego, which had always been larger than life, was shrinking before their eyes. Every move she made looked more desperate than the last. I felt a surge of quiet satisfaction, tempered by the suspense of what was about to come next. Karen wasn't just frustrated, she was realizing she had overplayed her hand. The master key, her weapon of authority, was powerless. The 911 call she had made in a fit of drama was now a liability, and the person in charge of enforcing reality wasn't some neutral officer, it was my son. He continued, voice steady and professional, "Making a false report to 911 is a serious offense. Misusing emergency services can carry penalties. You need to understand the potential consequences of your actions today." Karen's eyes widened. I could practically see the panic rise like smoke from her expression. The neighbors, who had been holding their breath, let out tiny, barely audible murmurs. I felt my pulse quicken not from fear, but from the thrill of watching this suburban drama reach its climax. She fumbled with the key again, jiggling it uselessly, muttering under her breath about rules and enforcement. My son didn't flinch. His calm authority made her antics look even more ridiculous. Every movement, every gesture, every desperate word she spoke was now on display for everyone to witness. I leaned against the doorframe, gripping my coffee, trying to steady myself. The suspense was unbearable, electric charged. Karen had built herself up as the ultimate HOA enforcer, but in reality, she had walked straight into a trap of her own making. The situation had turned completely upside down. Karen's final attempt at salvaging control came in the form of a stiff, dramatic wave of her hand, as if the key itself could magically restore her authority. But it was too late. The key was meaningless. Her voice, once commanding and threatening, now trembled. She tried to speak, but my son's calm, unwavering presence left her no room to maneuver. Finally, she muttered something incoherent and stepped back, key lowering slightly, face red with frustration and embarrassment. Her performance, which had begun with such confidence and pomp, had dissolved into something pitiful, almost tragic. I allowed myself a small, private smile. The suspense that had been building all morning had reached its peak. Karen's bluff had been called, and she had nowhere to hide. The dramatic crescendo of her overconfidence and the slow, methodical dismantling of it by my son had made for a perfect storm. Even as she turned and walked away, heels clicking furiously against the driveway, I knew the story wasn't entirely over. There were lessons learned here, not just for Karen, but for anyone who thought they could wield authority without understanding the law. And as for me, I finally felt the tension begin to release, knowing that the most dramatic part of the ordeal had passed, but that the real payoff, the final resolution, was still ahead. Karen's retreat down the driveway didn't feel like a victory for her. It felt like a slow, humiliating defeat, and everyone around could see it. Her heels clicked like the metronome of her own embarrassment, the key dangling uselessly in her hand as if mocking her. I could barely suppress my grin as I leaned against the doorframe, coffee in hand, watching her unravel in real time. But the real twist, the one that would leave her completely powerless, was about to hit. My son, calm and composed, had been quietly observing Karen, taking note of everything. Her exaggerated claims, her frantic dialing of 911, and her repeated insistence that she had authority she simply did not possess. "You need to understand something," he said, turning to me, still in that calm professional tone that had rendered Karen speechless. "Her report to 911 is recorded. Every word she said is documented. Filing false reports to emergency services is not just reckless, it's illegal." Karen froze mid-step, as if my son had thrown an invisible net over her. She had called the authorities to assert her dominance, to intimidate me into submission, and now that very action was turning against her. The tension was unbearable, but in the best possible way. Every neighbor peeking through blinds and windows now witnessed her power slipping like sand through her fingers. I could practically see the thought process in her eyes. What? How could this happen? I'm supposed to be in control here. But reality doesn't bend to someone's ego, no matter how loud they are or how many HOA meetings they've dominated. My son continued, firm but not unkind. "Misusing 911 for a non-emergency can carry fines, legal penalties, and community service requirements. You're lucky this is a first offense." Karen's jaw dropped. She took a hesitant step back, the weight of the situation finally settling on her shoulders. Her master key, her symbol of omnipotence, had failed spectacularly. The 911 call she had believed would assert her authority had instead exposed her recklessness to the community. The neighbors whispered among themselves. Some tried to stifle laughter, others exchanged incredulous glances. I could hear the soft murmur of gossip already beginning to spread down the street. Karen called the cops over a locked door, and now she might face consequences. Karen tried to speak, to salvage what little dignity she had left, but my son raised a hand politely. "I suggest you take some time to reconsider your actions today. Perhaps reflect on how far over the line you may have gone." Her face turned bright red. The humiliation was absolute. Every ounce of authority she had carried onto the street, every word of self-righteousness she had shouted, every dramatic gesture had come undone in front of everyone, including me. I sipped my coffee, savoring the moment quietly. The suspense, the tension, the long wait, it had all led to this perfect storm of justice. As she muttered something under her breath and finally walked away, defeated, I could see her shoulders slump. The master key that had once made her feel untouchable now looked more like a prop in a poorly written play. The very thing she thought gave her power had become her undoing. I turned to my son, feeling a swell of pride and gratitude. "Thank you," I said softly. "I couldn't have asked for a better outcome." He smiled, a mixture of professionalism and warmth. "You handled this well," he replied. "And remember, standing your ground within the law is always the right choice, even when someone tries to intimidate you." The suspense had finally resolved, but the thrill lingered. Karen had underestimated us both, me for staying calm, and him for being prepared. She had believed her theatrics and her so-called authority could bend reality. Instead, reality had hit back and hard. As the neighborhood returned to its usual quiet rhythm, I felt a sense of vindication. The suspense, the waiting, the uncertainty, had all built to this moment where justice, common sense, and a little bit of irony prevailed. Karen's overconfidence had led to her public humiliation, and the lesson was clear. Power is only real when backed by legality and common sense, not ego. And as for me, I finally allowed myself a small laugh. After all the suspense, the anxiety, and the ridiculous drama, the payoff was perfect. Karen had met her match, and in the end, she had no choice but to walk away, defeated, key in hand, dreams of dominance shattered. The street finally settled back into its quiet rhythm, though the echoes of the morning's drama lingered like a faint buzz in the air. I stepped outside, still holding my coffee, taking in the aftermath of what had just unfolded. The neighbors had returned to their routines, but I could see a few glances, a few subtle nods, acknowledging the spectacle they had just witnessed. Karen had left, heels clicking furiously as she retreated down the street, her master key dangling like a broken scepter of lost authority. I let out a slow breath, feeling a mix of relief, satisfaction, and disbelief. The tension that had been building all morning, the uncertainty, the anxiety, the sheer absurdity of the situation, was finally gone. But even in its absence, the thrill of what had just happened lingered. I turned toward my son, still standing by the cruiser, badge shining in the sunlight, uniform neat, the very picture of calm authority. "You were incredible," I said, trying to hide the grin that had been threatening to break free all morning. "I don't know if I could have handled it without you." He gave me a small, proud smile. "You handled your part perfectly," he said. "You stayed calm, followed the law, and let me do mine. That's the best way to handle someone like Karen." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "You mean someone like that," I added, glancing ruefully in the direction she had disappeared. I still can't believe she actually called 911 over a locked door, and she thought the master key would intimidate me. He chuckled, clearly amused, but maintained his professional composure. "Sometimes people overestimate their own importance," he said. "They think power comes from threats or props, but it really comes from knowledge, authority, and knowing your rights. That's something she clearly underestimated today." I sipped my coffee, enjoying the quiet after the storm. The suspense had been unbearable at times, the waiting for the sirens, the uncertainty of what would happen when law enforcement arrived, the fear that Karen might escalate things even further. But now, in hindsight, it all felt almost cinematic. I could imagine a narrator describing the scene: suburban drama, ego versus law, and the perfect twist when authority showed up in the form of my son. The neighbors, I realized, had been watching the entire ordeal. Some were curious, some entertained, and some were probably silently grateful that justice had prevailed without anyone getting hurt. I imagined the whispers and over fences and at weekend barbecues. "Did you hear about Karen and the master key?" I smiled to myself. Karen's reputation had taken a hit that no HOA newsletter could ever fix. And yet, there was a lesson in all this, beyond the comedy and the suspense. Standing your ground, knowing your rights, and staying calm under pressure is more powerful than any key, any badge of self-appointed authority, or any dramatic phone call. Karen had tried to intimidate, manipulate, and coerce, but she had underestimated what real authority and preparation could accomplish. I glanced at my son again, feeling a surge of pride. Not just because of his professionalism, but because he had been the perfect example of what it means to enforce the law with fairness, patience, and calm. He had not only protected me, but he had also exposed the absurdity of Karen's theatrics for everyone to see. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street, I finally allowed myself to relax fully. The suspense was gone, the morning's drama had resolved, and the lesson was clear: ego alone doesn't make you powerful. Law, preparation, and integrity do. And sometimes, a little poetic justice doesn't hurt either. I took one last sip of my coffee, smiling at the irony of it all. The master key had failed, Karen had been humiliated, and the 911 call had backfired spectacularly. Justice had been served in the most satisfying way possible, calmly, legally, and with a touch of humor that only suburban drama could provide. As I stepped back into the house, closing the door behind me, I felt a strange mix of triumph and amusement. The morning's tension, the suspense, the fear, it had all led to this perfect resolution. Karen had learned her lesson, the neighborhood had witnessed it, and I had survived to tell the tale. And if anyone asked, I would just smile, take a sip of my coffee, and say, sometimes the key isn't the key at all. It's knowing the law, staying calm, and having the right backup. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.